Hi, welcome to Perp Miniatures. I'm going to be kitbashing a Cawdor Redemptor priest. I started by building the body for the kitbash from the Cities of Sigmar Doralia Vendenst kit. Clipping the model from the sprue with my clippers, then cleaned any mold lines by scraping with my X-Acto blade. Once both parts were cleaned, I glued them together with plastic glue. I wanted to equip this model with an eviscerator, which is a big chain sword with a flamer attached to it. I started with a two-handed chain sword from the World Eater Jackal's kit, and the right arm from that kit as well. The right arm had a chain attached at the wrist, which didn't match the feel for this kit bash, so I clipped that off and glued the arm to the sword. I jumped into how the arms would connect, doing this step while the arm was still drying so I could move it around a bit still. Since the body had most of its right arm already, I had to clip part of the sword arm off. When I clipped the sword arm, it didn't quite sit flat against the arm of the base model, so I trimmed the body's arm with my X-Acto blade and checked the connection again, making small adjustments until they fit together well. Then I glued the sword onto the body with some sprue glue. This ended up being a lot more fiddly than I would have liked, as the arms kept moving around while I was trying to hold it in place, and kept moving to places that made the wrist placement on the left hand look unnatural. If I were to do this step again, I would try to pin the arms so I could check the placement before gluing, and to make it easier to hold in place. I left the chainsword for now, but we'll come back to finish up the flamer part later. Next, I started on the head. The Cawdor wear masks, and the Redemption side of the faction are particularly extreme in their beliefs, so I wanted to make this model wear a skull mask. For the base of the head, I took an Adeptus Mechanicus Guittari hooded head, and checked that it was about the right size for the model. The head sat a bit too high on the neck, so I clipped some of the piping around the neck and tested the fit, making small adjustments until I was happy with how it sat. Once the head sat right, I clipped the face out of the hood, first by cutting the majority of it out with my clippers, then scraping with my X-Acto blade until it was flat. I wanted to be able to see a mouth below the skull mask, so I took a head from the Kill Team Blooded kit and clipped it out from the sprue. I chose this face since it had an open mouth, as if the Cawdor priest were yelling mid-charge. My plan was to cut out just the face from the helmet, so I took my clippers and cut the majority of the helmet away from the head, making sure to give myself some extra space to trim down more carefully. Once the face was cut out, I was left with a bit of the helmet still on the top and the sides of the face, so I trimmed those off. I checked the face in the flat section of the hood, and then glued it into place using some sprue glue. Next was the skull mask itself. I grabbed a skull from the Citadel Skulls kit, making sure to grab one of the skulls without a lower jaw for the mask, and used a similar technique as the face before to cut just the front of the skull off. This time I got really lucky, and was left with a very thin piece of the skull. I bent the skull so it would fit better around the face, and checked for its fit. The nose of the face turned out to be a bit of a problem, keeping the skull from sitting nicely, so I clipped it off and checked the fit again. Now that the skull sat nicely against the face, I put down some sprue glue and attached the skull to the hood. I added in some plastic glue around the edges to help meld the sides of the skull into the hood as well. While that was drying, I took a lower jaw from the Citadel Skulls kit and glued that over the lower jaw of the face, bending the skull's jaw a bit to make it sit better on the face. Once that was dried, I trimmed the edges of the skull that stuck out a bit so it sat flat against the hood. Lastly, I drilled a small hole in the front part of the skull, for background lore reasons you'll learn about later in this video. Before gluing the head to the body, I wanted to attach some parts that might get in the way of the hood. Firstly, a gas tank for the flamer. Initially, I was thinking of using this jerry can from some old scale model, but it was way too big, so I ultimately went with a tank from the World Eater Jackal's kit. I cleaned up the bit and trimmed off some of the more chaosy spikes from the tank and glued it onto the back of the model. Next, I took a chainmail cape from the Kill Team Blooded kit and glued that onto the back, covering most of the gas tank. To connect the gas tank to the eviscerator, I grabbed a tube from the Skaven Stormfiend's kit and glued that onto the tank and where it landed on the chainsword. Once I was done with that, I decided it would be a good time to attach the head, so I checked the fit and found that the front of the cowl of the body was in the way, so I cut a small piece of it out with my clippers. Now that I was happy with how it sat, I glued it into place using some plastic glue. Once the head was in place, I went back to the eviscerator to make the flamer part for it. I wanted to connect a pipe of some sort to where I glued the fuel line earlier, So I checked a couple of the plasticard rod options I had, but they were either too small or too big. So I ended up going with a piece of brass rod I had that was just about the same size as the fuel line. I cut the brass rod with a pair of needle nose pliers, which left a bit of a crimped edge where I cut, so I sanded that side flat with a piece of sandpaper. For the business end of the flamer, I was looking for some mechanical bits that could hold the brass rod a bit off the chainsword. The first bit I found for this was on a Genestealer Cult standard from the Acolyte Icon Ward kit. I cut all of the parts around this central pipe bit, leaving the top section longer than the rest, and then snipped one of the shorter connections off, so I was left with a T-section. Next up, I took an axe from an old Chaos Space Marine Exalted Champion and cut all of the blade off, leaving only what I think is a power supply and a tube coming out of it. After cleaning up that bit by scraping with my X-Acto blade, I checked the connection to the pipe from the Genestealer kit and made some small adjustments to both parts so they fit together cleaner, then glued them together with a bit of sprue glue. After those pieces had some time to dry, I glued the brass rod in place to the fuel line and the flamer nozzle I just made using some super glue. Putting a bit of plastic glue on the T-section connector from the flamer's nozzle and left that assembly to dry. I glued the model down to the base for this next step, since part of the character's backstory is that he hit himself with the flamer and burnt one leg pretty bad. So I wanted to show the effects of that by giving the model a leg brace, and would need a solid connection to the base for that. I started the brace by cutting a section of plasticard tube and gluing the flat section around the knee of the model using some plastic glue. This would act as the joint for the leg brace. Then I took a small plasticard rod and cut a piece long enough to go from the knee joint I just glued on down to the base and glued that piece into place. Then I cut a smaller section for the opposite side of the leg and glued that into place as well. At this point I realized there was no connection to the foot of the model, so I cut a very small rectangle of plasticard to fit under these brace pieces, having to remove the plasticard rod on the left side to cut it down a small bit so that this flat piece of plasticard could fit under it, and glued everything into place with some plastic glue. I wanted to add more to the base, so I ended up cutting the model off with my X-Acto blade. Starting the basing by cutting a piece of thin plasticard a little bigger than the base itself. I glued the plasticard sheet onto the base initially, but I'll end up removing that in a later step. I wanted the base to look like the tilework of a church because of the Cawdor's religious themes. So I drew out a grid on the plasticard with a ruler, trying my best to make the squares as even as possible. Once the grid was done, I went back with my ruler and made shallow cuts along the lines with my X-Acto blade, making sure not to cut fully through the plasticard sheet. To widen the cuts to look like grout lines, I scraped at the shallow cuts with my X-Acto blade, drawing the blade sideways to make a groove. Once they were all widened, I wanted to add some more visual interest to the base, and since the model will be acting as the gang's leader, I would like to have them a little taller than all the other models. So I cut the plasticard sheet, leaving one row of the tiles on the base and removing the other 3 for now. Then, similar to before, I cut this thicker piece of plasticard a little bigger than the base, leaving a straight edge along where it would butt into the tiles still on the base. I checked that this piece fit on the base, and then scored the bottom side with my X-Acto blade before gluing. I found that without scoring this thicker sheet of plasticard, it doesn't glue well with the plastic glue, so I make a handful of scoring cuts in a couple different directions. Then I put down plenty of plastic glue on the base, and glued this thicker piece of plasticard down. Repeating the scoring on the top side now, and gluing the thin plasticard with the other 3 rows of tiles on top, trying to line up the lines of the tiles to this lower step, and left this assembly to dry. Once that was dry, I trimmed off the excess plasticard sheeting by cutting along the shape of the base with my X-Acto blade, using my clippers for some of the bigger pieces. After the majority of it was cut off, I scraped at the sides with the edge of my X-Acto blade to round the plasticard out until I was happy with the shape. To add some more visual interest to the base, and to make it look more weathered, I cut some cracks and gouges into the tiles by cutting some V-shapes into the plastic card, and scraping with the side of my X-Acto blade to widen them out a bit more. I was pretty happy with the base now, so I tested a few spots for the model to stand, drilling holes into the feet for pinning. Once the pins were in the feet, I held the model where I wanted it to stand on the base and tried to carefully push down so the pins left indents in the plastic card to show me where to drill holes for the base. Once I drilled the holes for the base, I glued the model down. I also had to re-glue one of the foot supports for the leg brace, which fell off when I cut the model off the base initially. Lastly, I added some candles from Alien Lab Creator to bring in some more Cawdor feel. With the kit bash done, I moved on to painting, which I'll show while reading the backstory for this model. The story of Jargo Thrice Burnt. While picking through a trash heap on the outskirts of Hive Mortis, Jargo found a piece of amber glass, something that intrigued him. Raising it towards a small pinprick hole of light in the hive's wall to inspect his find, Jargo soon heard a sizzling sound and felt his forehead burning. He recoiled in pain, lowering his head out of line of sight with the shard of glass. A few moments later, a trash heap behind Jargo burst into flames, quickly spreading through the refuse scattered all around. Unbeknownst to Jargo, a group of scavengers had been sneaking up on him while he was picking through scrap and had been using the trash piles to hide. Soon, many of them were burning, and several others ran from the quickly spreading flames. Jargo had been saved by this piece of glass, which now that he thought harder about it, must be from an old stained glass depiction of the God Emperor himself. Where else would this golden amber color of glass be from? The sounds of flame and screaming slowly dying away behind Jargo, he turned to inspect the scene and found a figure knelt just behind him. A scrawny man, hands outstretched towards Jargo, muttering about the power that he had just showed. Telling the figure to look up, Jargo held the piece of golden glass up once more and said, "Be judged in the light of the Emperor," and similar to his own forehead, burned a spot onto this figure. Telling the man then to stand, and gave him the name Lucerys First Judged. The two set out into the hive to find more followers. Over the next few grand cycles, Jargo the Burnt and his Redemptionists became a feared group within what was left of Hive Mortis. The Redemptionist cult took to wearing the skulls of fallen foes who they had judged in the fires of the Emperor, gathering a fair number of followers at the edge of Hive Mortis, and secured a fairly large part of a dome against the roaming horrors of the Dead Hive. On one prosecutorial expedition, Jargo led his gang into the Underhive to find heretics of the faith, still dwelling within the Dead Hive. In the midst of this search, a band of particularly bitey citizens rounded a corner and began charging towards the group. Jargo was quick to take up his eviscerator, golden glass of the Emperor fitted tightly into a compartment at the front of the flamer of his weapon, so his targets could be judged even here in the darkness of the Underhive. After starting a number of these attackers on fire, Jargo felt a sharp pain in his ankle. Looking down, he saw the unthinkable. This citizen, with what looked like leaves growing from its skull, had the audacity to bite Jargo. Turning his eviscerator on this foe quickly, he opened the flamer onto the creature and quickly burned it away, but also caught his own leg in the fire and horribly burned himself in the process. Cycles later, Jargo Twice Burnt limped his way back to the secured dome, the only survivor of the expedition. More time passed, and Jargo Twice Burnt had grown quite the following. Now a long line of supplicants crowd the streets in front of Jargo's cathedral awaiting judgment by the priest. It is not uncommon to see some of these unjudged fall over from starvation or fatigue, and immediately the line fills in overtop them. The judged are given preferential treatment, more food, better hovels to live within, while the unjudged are left to fend for themselves, making a meager living off what scraps are left from the judged. The line seldom moves though, as the inclement weather of the ash wastes outside rarely allows enough sunlight for Jargo to judge his followers in the light of the Emperor, leading to long periods of wait. One such period, Jargo was standing atop his dais, looking through the golden glass piece towards a speck of light through the hive wall. A servant came to refill his tea, pot still steaming, just off the heating unit. Jargo, distracted by his inspection of the light levels from outside, reached for his teacup as the servant was filling it and burnt his hand. Jargo leapt into a rage and quickly grabbed the servant, accusing him of attempted assassination. Just as he said this, the light from outside picked back up, and Jargo decided that this was a sign that the servant be judged immediately. The resulting judgment left the servant dead on the floor of the dais, a hole burned clean through their skull. The newly titled Jargo Thrice Burnt declared the man to have been a heretic and assassin, and for their skull to be brought forth as a new mask for the redemption priest to wear while on his prosecutorial expeditions. Most citizens find themselves unable to prepare ahead of time for the indeterminable wait, and must take a more dangerous choice, that of prosecution. When Jargo Thrice Burnt journeys out into the hive to find heretics, he takes a band of followers with him, though any of the unjudged are welcome to join. For an unjudged to be allowed to follow the band outside the dome's secure walls, they are only allowed a knife or similar cutting object. If they are able to kill even a single heretic while on these prosecutorial expeditions, and make it back alive, they are allowed to jump ahead in the line and be judged. Many do not return from these expeditions, but even still, the line fills, and more are forced to take the risk outside the dome walls. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed your time here, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.